Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Simcha Yakubovich. It's not easy. Simcha Yakubovich. I'm a three-time Emmy-winning filmmaker in the category of investigative journalism. And my brand, so to speak, is to bring the tools of investigative journalism into the realm of archaeology, biblical archaeology, and history. My next few videos are going to be about the war against the Jews today and its historical roots. I've already posted one such video, Palestine 101, which you can find on this channel, where I argued, just a fact, that there never was an independent state called Palestine ever in history, not for one day. But what I want to point out now, what I want to investigate now, is that this invention of Palestine is not something new. It's part of a historical process that started thousands of years ago, and the goal is to go after the Jewish people. Genocide is the goal. So the way it works, the process, is first you change the language. Where you have Jews or Israelites or Hebrews, you get rid of them in language. You call Israel Palestine. You call Judea the West Bank. You just get rid of them in language. Once you've done that, you've facilitated the next step, airbrushing the Jews out of history. And when you've accomplished that, that's a preface to going after the Jews themselves. It's an introduction to genocide. It's an attempt to just simply remove the Jews from the face of the planet. And it started some 3,500 years ago with the invention of a people that didn't exist called the Hyksos. So according to academics, who are the Hyksos? Well, to know who the Hyksos are, we have to take a step back. The Jews, who are the Jews? The Jewish people say that the founding event in their history, an event that's referred to daily in Jewish prayer, that's celebrated once a year for 3,500 years, is the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt in ancient times, 3,500 years ago, when they went from slavery to liberty. When they left Egypt, went to the Sinai desert, rallied around Mount Sinai, the liberator Moses, who went up there as a prophet to speak to God, came down with the 10 Commandments. And it's at that moment that the Jewish people became a people, not just a bunch of Israelite tribes. And from there, they went to the Promised Land. They went to Canaan and established 3,500 years ago a Jewish kingdom, Judea, Israel. Along come scholars and say, it never happened. That's a myth. You know, like Aphrodite and Zeus, it's just a myth. It's a made-up story. I'm not sure what other people have to constantly defend their founding story. Only the Jewish people have to constantly say that their founding story is not a myth. It actually happened. Scholars say, yeah, at some point you guys gelled into a people, but it wasn't at the biblical Exodus. There's no evidence. There's absolutely no archaeological or script. There's no material evidence that this ever happened. If it would have happened, there'd be a lot of hieroglyphics. The Egyptians would say, oh my God, those slaves left. But there's not a single shred of evidence. It didn't happen. So say most of the scholars. There are a few exceptions. So wait a minute, is that true? First thing that any good journalist, and we're getting fewer and far between, any good journalist says, asks very simple questions. Is there really no evidence? I asked that question when I started investigating this. I started looking, started contacting Egyptologists, and I say, is there no evidence, zero evidence, that a group of people left ancient Egypt, went into the Sinai, and ended up in the Promised Land in Israel? Well, they say it kind of did happen, but not the Jews. Oh, really? It was the Hyksos. Really? Well, they didn't leave they were expelled. A whole mass of people were expelled from Egypt. Yeah. And where did they go? Well, they went to the Sinai. Oh, they went to the Sinai. And where did they go after? Well, they went to Canaan. But they weren't the Jews. Why do you say that? It sounds exactly like the biblical story. It sounds exactly like the founding story of the Jewish people. Why do you say it wasn't them? It was these other people called the Hyksos. Well, because the Hyksos were expelled around 1500 BC. Whereas the Jews, their exodus didn't really happen, but if it happened, which it didn't, it happened around 1270 BC. That's over 200-year difference. I was shocked. I said, really? You're dating something that happened 3,500 years ago. The two events are 200 plus years apart, and you are so sure of your dating that you're just ignoring the fact that the two stories match perfectly. There are thousands of items of evidence, archaeological inscriptions of the expulsion of the Hyksos, and yet you dare say there's zero evidence for the Exodus? How is that possible? Well, if it happened, say the scholars, the Exodus didn't happen, but if it happened around 1270 BC. Really, you're dating an event that didn't happen? Do you understand how illogical that is to say if it happened, which it didn't? And then they're not just saying around 1300 BCE, they're saying 1270 or 1220 or 1250. They give an exact date for something that didn't happen. Well, let's look at it. Did anybody ever say that the Hyksos were the Jews, or at least part of these so-called Hyksos? Yeah. Manetho, ancient Egyptian priest, writing about 150, 200 years BCE, he says, those Hyksos, they're related to the Jews. Josephus, the first century historian, he says those Hyksos, they're really talking about the Jews. Where does this term come from? It means ruler from a foreign land. It's not an ethnicity, it's a title. So the Egyptians say some of the pharaohs, some of the kings that ruled over us, and we didn't like them because they were foreigners, some of these people were foreigners, Hyksos. Well, Hyksos to you too. Joseph, the biblical Joseph, was such a person. He was an Israelite who ruled in Egypt. He was a Hyksos, but there was no nation called Hyksos. That's made up. Well, you're sort of right, Simcha, scholars would say. The nation was not called Hyksos. It was called Amu. Really, Amu? I just want to point something out. Amu appears thousands of times in the Egyptian texts. And the second thing is that we don't know how Egyptians pronounce things. Scholars kind of agree that these three hieroglyphics, or four, that these are to be pronounced Amu. This word appears hundreds of times in the Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, the original Bible, to this day, we call Israel Amo Israel, the people of Israel. Amo, Ain, Mem, Vav, the three Hebrew letters that spell Amu, that you can also pronounce Amo. It's the same letters. They are the same words that appear for the Hyksos. And these Amu were expelled. You have a perfect fit between the biblical story and the Egyptian annals. But they don't want to say that it was the Hebrews or the Israelites that were expelled or that left slavery and went into the Sinai. By using the term Hyksos and using the term Amu, they basically airbrush the Jews out of their own founding story. Now, what ethnicity do scholars make up for these Amu? Until 1966, not 2,000 years ago, they said they were Hurrians or Indo-Europeans, basically Aryans. German scholars loved that, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, because they were Nazis. And they couldn't imagine that their beloved ancient Egyptians were ruled by anybody except Aryans. Couldn't be the Jews. Couldn't be that the Jews, like Joseph, reached positions of power. No, no, no. The Jews are Untermenschen, they said, subhuman. Aryans ruled ancient Egypt, and the Egyptians called them Hyksos. I say 1966, John Van Seters, a Canadian-Dutch academic, says, guys, there isn't any evidence of these Aryan presence in Egypt. All these people that the ancient Egyptians called Hyksos, they were Semites. Now notice, not Jews, Semites. True enough, some of them are Canaanites. Not all people that scholars call Hyksos were Israelites. Some were Canaanites, some were Israelites. But they were Semites. And suddenly, only in the 1960s, and it took time for Van Seters' thesis to be accepted, into the 70s, only like 40, 50 years ago, did people say, hey, buddies, we're not going to call them Jews. No, no, no. But they were Semites. And where did they go? Well, they went to Syria, they went to Iraq, they went to the Levant, they went to Syro-Palestine, they went to everywhere. Canaan, they'll never say Israel. They'll call the land of Israel all kinds of other names. Why? Airbrush the Jews out of history. And the Jews scholars go along with this, because otherwise nobody's going to be invited to a conference. And they go, no, no, it means Israel, but it's Syro-Palestine, it's the Levant, it's retinue. That's what ancient Egyptians called it. It all comes to the same thing. It's Israel. Now, there should be archaeological evidence that once the Israelites left Egypt, they went to the Sinai. Is there any evidence of a tribal people suddenly, at the time of the Exodus, appearing in the archaeological annals in the Sinai desert? Well, there is. Lots. They're called Shasu, bandits, by the ancient Egyptians. Well, what's the problem then, right? The Jews were in the Sinai. No, 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 they weren't the Jews. They were Shasu. So the Hyksos were expelled. Where did they go? They disappeared. And who suddenly appeared in the desert? It was the Shasu. Why do they call them Shasu? Because the ancient Egyptians suddenly refer to the tribes that are in the desert and that are fighting, as the Bible says, against the Amalekites and Midianites and so on, as Shasu. What does Shasu mean? It means basically bandits, roving, nomadic, shepherding bands of bandits from an Egyptian point of view. They didn't like those Jews. But the people they call Shasu are clearly Israelites. They're in the desert, they're fighters, they're shepherds, they're nomads, and there's even pictures of these Shasu. They have side curls, like the Hasids in New York. And when they fight with the ancient Egyptians and the Egyptians beat them, normally what the Egyptian soldiers do is they cut off a hand to prove that they killed an enemy. With the Shasu, they cut off their private parts. And there's pictures of this. They've sculpted this into the walls. And guess what? These people were circumcised. And who did they worship? Well, they worshiped the God of Israel. There's two inscriptions in Egypt and one in Nubia. African pharaohs talk about the Shasu who worship Jehovah. Well, clearly they're Israelites. No, no, no. Let's just keep calling them Shasu. Well, do they ever get to the promised land, these Shasu? Well, yeah, they do. They're called Apiru or Habiru. But don't get the wrong impression, say the academics. They're not the Hebrews. No, they're Apiru. And who are these Apiru? Well, they're like the people that followed Joshua when he conquers Israel, right? They were warriors, but they weren't Israelites. So what you have around the biblical Exodus is an entire academic mobilization of bias, sociologists call it, what it is really. It's a conspiracy to, they're not sitting in a room conspiring, but it's a mindset. It's a mindset whose goal is to first get rid of the Jews from language, call them Hyksos, Shasu, Apiru, Habiru, and then once you got rid of them, confront the Jews and say, your story, your founding story, your constitutional story, and your link to the promised land of Israel, it's a myth. Yes, if there were some Hyksos around, they could claim a link to the promised land. If there were Shasu around, they could claim a link to the promised land. If those Habiru were still around, they could claim a link to the promised land, but they're not. You're around, they're gone. Get rid of the Jews and language, change the terminology, airbrush them out of history, and then you can start talking about from the river to the sea, let's get rid of the Jews. Genocide began 3,500 years ago, and its goal is always the same: invent a people so you can get rid of the Jews.